At the dawn of the 20th century, Canada was in the early stages of forging its identity. It wasn't alone. Several countries came into being, including Australia in 1901, Cuba in 1902, and Panama in 1903, with roughly 6 to 8 new nations forming during that era. As for Canada had become a self-governing dominion in 1867, yet it remained closely tied to the British Crown. Many Canadians still identified primarily as British subjects. 1900, Canada was largely rural and agrarian, with a growing population, budding urban centers, and a society marked by rigid social hierarchies. This blog post takes you on a journey into what life was like in Canada in 1900, its economy, social conditions, gender roles, infrastructure, and more, and concludes with a comparison to modern-day Canada. Population and demographics. In 1900, Canada's population was just over 5 million across 7 provinces. Ontario was the most populous, with approximately 2.2 million residents, followed by Quebec, with 1.65 million. Nova Scotia counted around 459,454 people, New Brunswick 331,120, Manitoba 255,000, British Columbia 178,657, and Prince Edward Island 103,259. At the time, Alberta and Saskatchewan were still part of the Northwest Territories and would not join Confederation as provinces until 1905. Although British Columbia was still relatively remote, its population was beginning to grow along the Pacific coast. Completing the transcontinental Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885 became a vital link, serving as the principal transportation route uniting eastern and western Canada. The population was overwhelmingly of European descent, especially British and French, with Indigenous peoples marginalized both socially and geographically. The immigration boom, which brought waves of Eastern Europeans and Asians, was only beginning. Canada was in the process of settling the West through aggressive immigration policies, often at the expense of Indigenous communities. Life expectancy in 1900 was significantly shorter than it is today. At the beginning of the 20th century, Canadian men typically lived to about 50, while women lived slightly longer, averaging between 52 and 54 years. By 2025, that figure has nearly doubled, with Canada's average life expectancy at birth reaching 82.88 years. Daily life and work. Most Canadians lived in rural areas and worked in agriculture, forestry, fishing, or small-scale manufacturing. Farming was the cornerstone of daily life, especially in Ontario, the Prairies, and the Maritimes. Work was hard, physical, and seasonal. Mechanized equipment was minimal, and many tasks were still performed by hand or with the help of animals. Factory jobs became common in urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. Industrialization was rising, but working conditions were often harsh, with extended hours, few protections, and low wages. Labor-intensive chores defined household life. Washing clothes meant using a washboard and soap. Heating came from wood-burning stoves. Homes had no electricity in many areas, and indoor plumbing was rare outside major cities. Gender roles and family life. Gender roles in 1900s Canada were rigid and traditional. Men were considered the breadwinners, while women were expected to marry, bear children, and manage the household. Large families were ordinary, partly due to high infant mortality and the need for labor on farms. Women had few legal rights and were excluded from most professions and the right to vote, which would begin to change in the 1910s and 1920s. Education for girls was improving, but opportunities for higher education or careers were limited. Women's suffrage movements were active but still gaining momentum. Children were often expected to work from a young age, especially in farming families, and formal education typically ended in early adolescence, especially for boys who were needed on the land. Housing and infrastructure. Housing in 1900 varied by region and class. In rural areas, homes were often log or frame structures with 1 or 2 rooms. The working class lived in small, crowded tenements in urban areas, while the wealthy lived in large Victorian homes. Electricity was beginning to appear in major cities. Telephones existed, but were a luxury. Horses and carriages dominated transportation, although bicycles were becoming popular. The automobile was an emerging novelty, with fewer than 200 in the country. The Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885, connected the east and west coasts and was instrumental in expanding settlement and trade. Trains were the fastest and most reliable form of long-distance travel. Indigenous peoples and colonialism. For Indigenous peoples in Canada, 1900 was a time of profound trauma. Residential schools were in operation, designed to assimilate Indigenous children and erase their cultures forcibly. Indigenous communities had been displaced from their ancestral lands and were subjected to the Indian Act, which restricted their rights, movement, and governance. Traditional hunting and fishing rights were curtailed, and economic opportunities were limited. The legacy of colonialism was already deep-rooted, setting the stage for generations of systemic inequality and injustice. Technology and innovation. In 1900, Canada was at the very beginning of a technological transformation. The telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell, who spent part of his life in Canada, was beginning to change communication. Telegraph lines crisscrossed the country. Electric lights and streetcars were appearing in major cities. However, outside urban centers, people still lived as much as they had in the 19th century. Entertainment was local. Community gatherings, church socials, or the occasional traveling circus. The first movie theaters, Nickelodeons, had only just arrived. Newspapers were the dominant form of mass communication, and literacy rates were climbing, especially in cities. Government and national identity. 1900 Canada had its federal government but relied heavily on Britain for foreign policy. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier was in office, promoting national unity and expansion into the West. Canada's military was small, and Canadians would fight in imperial wars like the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, under British command. The sense of a uniquely Canadian identity was emerging but still fragile. Many Canadians, especially in English-speaking provinces, saw themselves first as part of the British Empire. French Canadians, particularly in Quebec, retained a distinct cultural identity and often felt excluded from the national narrative. Comparing Canada in 1900 to Canada in 2025, fast forward to 2025, and the transformation is almost unimaginable. Today, Canada is a multicultural, technologically advanced society of nearly 40 million people. The vast rural majority of 1900 has shifted to a predominantly urban population, with cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal serving as global cultural and economic hubs. In 1900, the average Canadian could expect to live less than 50 years. Today, life expectancy exceeds 80. Electricity, indoor plumbing, internet access, and modern healthcare are standard, not luxuries. Most children now attend school through grade 12 and beyond, with a growing emphasis on higher education and digital literacy. Women's and LGBTQ+ rights. Where once women had no vote and few legal rights, today Canada has had a female prime minister, and women participate fully in public life, government, and the workforce. LGBTQ+ rights, environmental protection, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, concepts unheard of in 1900, are now central to national discourse. That said, the legacy of Canada's colonial past remains a challenge. Indigenous communities continue to face disparities in housing, healthcare, and education. Truth and reconciliation efforts are ongoing, aiming to address the generational trauma caused by the residential school system and systemic discrimination. The modern Canadian economy. In 1900, Canada relied on agriculture and resource extraction for its economic development. By 2025, it will lead in technology, clean energy, and advanced manufacturing sectors. The shift from horses to high-speed rail, electric vehicles, and space exploration marks a profound leap in human capability and ambition. In short, Canada has evolved from a largely rural, colonial outpost into one of the world's most developed and inclusive democracies. Yet the echoes of its past still inform its present. As we reflect on how far the country has come since 1900, it's also a moment to appreciate the struggles, resilience, and aspirations that shaped the Canada we know today.